better part of the last 3 decades, WWE's Monday Night Raw has been the pro wrestling show most synonymous with the industry at large. A who's who of squared circle royalty have passed through Raw's various entrance sets since 1993, and its residual placement in prime time on Monday nights has made the show appointment TV for generations of fans, both diehard and casual. For much of Raw's time on air, we've gotten used to a number of sights, sounds, and setups. When Raw added Is War to its name in 1997, we quickly got used to 15-minute opening promos, impromptu challenge matches, the Titantron, lively crowds in big cities, and signature production that puts WWE a cut above the competition, unnecessary shaky camera effects aside. But the Raw formula that we've become accustomed to wasn't always there. In the salad days of the program between 1993 and early 1997, Raw was a much different beast, and it was quite unrecognizable from the powerhouse it would eventually become. If you became a fan during the eras of Attitude, Ruthless Aggression, or latter-day PG, the factoids in the following video may surprise you a bit, because this is the way Raw once was, and it's kinda hard to believe, even for modern fans that did experience it the first time around. I'm Adam Pacitti from Cultaholic Wrestling, and these are 10 ways Raw used to be much, much different. Join us. Number 10, the main event went on first. The main event is the featured attraction, and as such is traditionally the grand finale to a night of wrestling action. You wouldn't know this though if you watched then WWF circa 93 or 94, because the way episodes of Raw were stacked, the featured match went on much, much earlier. You'd begin with something like, say, Tatanka versus Crush, and then the final match of the hour, remember Raw used to be only 1 hour long, would be Kwang kicking some enhancement talent's head off. Why was it done this way, though? Well, WWE apparently transplanted a bit of this format from that of Saturday night's main event, in that you front-load the program with all the important stuff. As the night progresses, kids will be going to bed, especially if they have school the next day, so you make sure they see all the good stuff as early as possible. Now, that made sense for Saturday night's main event because that final Who Cares match wouldn't air until closer to 1 o'clock in the morning, so putting Hogan versus whoever on just before midnight was sensible. But Raw seemed to do itself a disservice by not giving fans, especially older ones, a reason to remain tuned in up to the much earlier 10 PM hour. By 1995, this format was phased out, and that was for the best. Number 9, jobber matches galore. Once in a while, we do get a squash match on Raw or SmackDown or even AEW Dynamite, but they're more a delicacy these days. Do the time warp to mid-90s Raw, and they were the majority of any given broadcast. Once you got your opening main event of Lex Luger versus IRS out of the way, it was time for the parade of squashes to commence, usually 3 or 4 matches deep. On Brawler, on Horowitz, on Hardy and Gill, on Riggins, on Myers, give the locals their fill. Now, this wasn't a new concept invented for Raw. TV squashes have existed for decades, and for WWE, they were exhibitions to get the name brand stars over while selling you on upcoming house shows and pay-per-views. Before the advent of WCW Monday Nitro, which quickly began dispensing with star versus star battles on free TV, WWE had little reason to give away potentially lucrative bouts without the consumer paying for them. The WWE title never changed hands on Monday Night Raw until 1997, and in fact was rarely ever defended on the program until competition came along. Until then, Raw was simply low-impact programming with this one featured bout at a host of prelim beatings format with very little deviation. Number 8, not the most impressive venues or cities. Think about pre-pandemic Raw in its glory years. Chicago's Allstate Arena one week, LA's Staples Center the next, Philly's Wells Fargo Center the week following, and then Atlanta's State Farm Arena. Even historic Madison Square Garden would turn up in the touring loop. Point being, you could set your watch to Monday Night Raw emanating from a good-sized NBA or NHL venue with a minimum of 12 or 13,000 cheering revelers making themselves heard. The atmosphere could make a match like Eugene versus Rob Conway feel WrestleMania 3 worthy. Now go back to those mid-90s doldrums, and what do you see? You see rec centers, armories, and high school gymnasiums out the wazoo. Smaller cities like Bushkill, Pennsylvania, Poughkeepsie, New York, and Burlington, Vermont played host to Raw with usually no more than 1,500 to 2,000 fans on hand. Usually, a self-conscious Vince McMahon would have to sell the city to the home audience by mentioning the local college football team, or that so-and-so city city is the birthplace of cottage cheese or something. One 1994 Raw taping emanated from the high school gym in Liberty, New York, so imagine you're leaving class for the day on a Monday afternoon, and inside the gymnasium they're setting up the ring so that the #1 American wrestling promotion can take TV that night. The Garden, this was not. Number 7, multiple shows were taped at once. Today, sitting through 3 hours of Monday Night Raw can be a chore, and that's even with a mostly impressive roster of flashy and skillful wrestlers. Could you imagine doing that a quarter of a century ago, when the WWE roster was littered with hokey occupational gimmicks, and the company felt compelled to trot out one squash match after another? One televised hour of the aforementioned is trying enough. Try sitting in the arena when they filmed those programs, because WWE would tape 3 or 4 episodes of the show at a time. Now, yes, they were only 1-hour shows, but you're looking at somewhere between 12 to 14 squash matches, only a few star versus star battles, up to 3 King's Court interview segments, not to mention dark matches where they would run tryouts, as well as film matches for future Coliseum video releases. By 1995 to 96, WWE would film a staggering 4 episodes at a time, a month's worth of TV to bridge from one monthly pay-per-view to the next. And those taped episodes suffer from some of the worst crowd sweetening you've ever heard. A super heavyweight like Yokozuna would crash to the canvas, and where you should be hearing the thud of mammoth glutes hitting steel and wood, that's drowned out by the same static soundbed of piped-in audience. And you thought the so-called SmackDown hairdryer sounded phony. Number 6, they tried to make taped shows feel live. A truthful biography of Vince McMahon would be a portrait of a very, very odd man. His quirks go beyond the oft-reported aversion to sneezing and reveal an individual with a predilection for focusing his attention on seemingly trivial matters. Take, for example, those episodes of Raw that were filmed during those interminable filming blocks and dropped in the can for a later airing. Now, to a true blue believer sitting on their couch, it doesn't make the blindest bit of difference if the show is live or taped. You know, they're watching, aren't they? Tell that to Vince, though, who on commentary would make really awkward attempts at convincing everyone that this taped show was live. That's because while those matches were a week or 2 old, the commentary was done live, or at the very least recorded sometime that Monday. To demonstrate that everything was live, McMahon would reference recent news stories that had nothing to do with wrestling. Say, for instance, then-President Bill Clinton lost his credit card at a hotel on the previous Saturday. On commentary, McMahon would then say something like, "And Adam Bomb, he looks like he's just lost his bearings, the same way President Clinton just lost his credit card, blah blah blah," and so forth. See, that just happened, so Raw is clearly fresh and new. Bruce Pritchard discussed having to pore through newspapers on broadcast day to find topical matters for Vince to discuss during Raw, and you just ask, what's the point, really? Number 5, Raw's early schedule had to deal with house shows. On the surface, this might not sound so weird. In the brand split era, SmackDown has run live events on Monday nights in relative conjunction with Raw, while the latter filmed its TV in a different city, so it's not uncommon for 2 WWE events to run at the same time, even if one is televised. But in 1993, things were a wee bit different. See, because live event touring schedules were set up long in advance, when Raw began taping at New York's Manhattan Center that January, they were double booked to a degree. On a given Monday, a handful of wrestlers wrestlers were brought in from the house show loop to New York for the Raw tapings for reportedly meager payoffs, while the remainder of the roster stayed out on the road. One such example occurred in early February, when a good chunk of the WWE roster appeared in Toronto on Super Bowl Sunday, and then most of them boarded a flight for a European tour, while a select number stayed behind to hit up the Raw tapings. Later, the Go Home Raw broadcast for WrestleMania 9 was populated by roughly half a roster, while the others worked a house show in St. Louis. Eventually, WWE were able to configure a schedule that made more logistical sense in terms of prioritizing Raw, but at first, coordinating talent for these endeavors was migraine-inducing. Number 4, green screen technology. Criticisms of WWE's modern camera work aside, the production value of their TV broadcasts are about as state-of-the-art as you can get. From the Saturday night's main event period onward, and even in the crowdless era, you know you're watching a major league broadcast when you flip on WWE. Even in the leaner mid-90s, WWE still looked pretty up-to-date in production terms, but there were certainly a few quibbles. Remember when we spoke earlier of Vince McMahon shoehorning in topical references to create a sensation of liveness? That is nothing compared to this. You know how at times during a WWE broadcast they'll show the announcers either at the beginning or perhaps between matches to offer exposition? When already taped episodes of Raw would broadcast, we would get the aforementioned live announcing, but that was not all. To kick off the shows, McMahon and his partner, Lawler, Cornette, Michaels, whoever, would appear in front of a green screen with a static shot of the Raw crowd behind them. If it were live, you could tell the fans could see Vince and his colleague and would somewhat react to their physical presence. But here, there is a clear disconnect. Even funnier, they would also show the commentators at their ringside table with a green screen crowd behind them, and I mean, come on. Can you imagine WWE doing something like this today? Even people who went on public record exposing the business would be like, dude, you're exposing the business, WTF. Number 3, random commercial breaks. Well, they weren't truly random, like, say, an RKO when you're minding your business doing the gardening. The WWE TV product we see today is very regimented, so much that frequent viewership leads to one finding out the patterns, particularly when it comes to commercial breaks. More often than not, a wrestler either hits a suicide dive onto his opponent, or just sends his opponent scurrying to the outside after an offensive flurry. This was Michael Cole's cue for years to tell us Raw rolls on as he segues into a break. Then we return and somebody has a rest hold applied. Sounds formulaic, doesn't it? Well, WWE of days gone by was anything but in that regard. Wrestlers and producers didn't tailor the matches to fit in and around the ordained commercial breaks, so sometimes you would get a wrestler attempting a pinfall or applying a submission hold when all of a sudden "We'll be right back" would pop up on screen. When they would return, anything could be happening. Somebody could be coming off the top rope, or two combatants may be in the midst of a slugfest, somebody setting up for a trademark move, anything at all. Today, WWE has gotten managing commercials down to a science, but in another period, far less thought was put into that practice. In fact, one time, Mr. Perfect defeated Rick Martel during a commercial break, which is still a better ending than Rollins and Fiend inside the cell. Number 2, the show was sometimes preempted. These days, USA Network may as well be WWE Network in and of itself. Its original drama programming has gradually whittled down, while WWE maintains a very heavy presence either with traditional wrestling programs or with TV series starring the likes of Steve Austin, The Miz, and Maurice. Some would go so far as to say that without WWE, USA Network really has nothing to offer, with little more than its bevy of first-run police procedurals to fill the hours with. In short, WWE knows USA needs them a little more than perhaps they once did. But at one time, WWE didn't exactly have the run of the place. Before Vince McMahon took his sports entertainment properties to what was then TNN in the year 2000, Monday Night Raw and Primetime Wrestling before it had to put up with at least 3 preemptions a year. 1 week in February due to the Westminster Kennel Club Dog Show, and 2 weeks at the end of the summer for the US Open Tennis Tournament, all of which aired on USA. When WWE returned to USA in 2005, they received better treatment to where a sister station like CNBC would carry the dog show or tennis in those weeks. Before then, it was just something McMahon and company had to deal with, as some Mondays came and went with no wrestling at all. Number 1, the PostMania show used to mean nothing whatsoever. The Raw after WrestleMania 37 was a downer in much the same way that everything else of the time became a downer. No crowd, more restrictions, and unpleasant reality all around. When crowds return, so too will that post-WrestleMania fervor, with a frenzied audience, an NXT talent or two making their main roster debut, and some light table setting for the months ahead. It should be noted though that these post-Mania Raws didn't really become in vogue until way into the current stadium era of the big events. Back in the 90s, post-Mania virtually meant nothing at all. In fact, the post-WrestleMania 9 episode of Raw was actually taped 2 weeks earlier, and besides fresh commentary that referenced the events of Sunday, there was nothing grand about the show. Subsequent years aired the event live, and there would be some notable moments, like Alundra Blaze winning her second women's title, and the debut of Mankind. Mostly though, they were just regular old episodes of Raw in front of small crowds, but with a few scant nods to the extravaganza that preceded it. Through Through the years since, Monday Night Raw became in many ways the standard of what a televised weekly wrestling show should resemble, and many of its most recognized tropes are time-tested. But it took a little time to crystallize the renowned formula, and until then, Raw looked almost nothing like the institution that it would eventually become. The show's roots indicate nothing of the trend-setting that was to come, and to see Raw in its primitive form is to see something almost completely unrelated to its ensuing glory.